The morning air in the Blue Ridge Mountains held that special kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't feel empty but full. Full of mist curling around tall pines, full of birds just starting their songs, full of the soft rustle of leaves letting go and drifting down to the earth. It was the kind of morning that made you want to breathe deep and slow, like the world itself was taking a peaceful sigh. And on this particular October morning, high up on a ridge where the road turned to gravel and then to dirt, a small cabin stood waiting. Not just any cabin. It was the place where two people were about to say yes to each other for the rest of their lives. Inside, things were calm but buzzing with that gentle kind of energy that only comes before something truly meaningful. The bride sat by the window wrapped in a soft ivory robe, her hair still damp from a quick shower. She wasn't fidgeting or pacing like you might expect. Instead, she just watched the fog lift off the treetops, her hands resting in her lap, a small smile playing on her lips. She'd been dreaming of this day for years. Not the fancy dress or the big party, but the simple truth of standing next to the person she loved most and promising to walk through life together. Everything else was just decoration. Down the hall, in the tiny bedroom that smelled faintly of cedar and old books, the groom was tying his tie in front of a mirror that had a crack running diagonally across one corner. He kept messing it up. First too loose, then too tight, then crooked. He laughed at himself, shaking his head. "You've taught high schoolers algebra for 8 years," he muttered. "But you can't tie a knot." Finally, on the 5th try, it looked right. He smoothed down his shirt, took a deep breath, and looked at his reflection. His eyes were bright, not with nerves, but with something deeper, certainty. He knew, without a single doubt, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Outside, a few close friends and family members were already arriving, parking their cars along the edge of the woods. They carried folding chairs, a cooler with sparkling cider, and a basket of homemade pastries still warm from the oven. There were no grand decorations, just string lights draped along the porch railing, a few jars of wildflowers on the steps, and an old wooden arch someone had dragged out from the barn and wrapped with ivy. It wasn't fancy, but it was real, and that's what mattered. The couple had met 5 years earlier, not in some dramatic movie-style moment, but in the most ordinary way possible, volunteering at a community garden in a city hundreds of miles away. They'd both shown up on a rainy Saturday to help build raised beds for a school's outdoor classroom. She was organizing tools. He was trying and failing to level a plank with a wobbly spirit level. They got to talking, then laughing, then sharing coffee under a leaky awning while the rain poured down around them. Neither of them knew it then, but that soggy afternoon was the first stitch in a life they'd eventually weave together. Over the years, they built something quiet and strong. They didn't post every moment online or make grand declarations. Instead, they showed up, for each other, for their students, for their neighbors. They cooked simple dinners, took weekend hikes, argued over whose turn it was to take out the trash, and always held hands when they walked through parking lots. Their love wasn't loud, but it was steady, like a heartbeat you don't notice until you stop and listen. When they decided to get married, they knew right away they didn't want a big production. No rented ballroom, no DJ, no $100 plates. They wanted intimacy. They wanted stillness. They wanted to be able to hear each other's voices without shouting over music. So they found this cabin, a place they'd stayed once during a summer getaway, tucked away where cell service faded and the only sounds at night were crickets and wind in the trees. The owner, an older woman with kind eyes and a thick Appalachian accent, had agreed to let them use the property for the ceremony. "Just leave it clean," she'd said, "and maybe leave a little joy behind." By 10 o'clock, everyone had arrived, 20 people in total, including 2 young nieces who kept chasing each other around the yard with dandelions stuck behind their ears. The groom stood near the arch, shifting his weight from foot to foot, not out of anxiety, but because he couldn't stop smiling. Every time he thought about what was about to happen, his chest felt too full, like his heart had grown 3 sizes overnight. Then from inside the cabin, the soft notes of a guitar began to play, just a simple melody, finger-picked by a friend who'd brought his instrument along. It wasn't a wedding march. It was a song they both loved, one they'd listened to on their first road trip together, windows down, singing off-key as they drove through the desert at sunset. As the music floated out into the crisp air, the bride appeared in the doorway. She wasn't wearing a traditional gown. Instead, she'd chosen a simple dress the color of morning light, soft flowing fabric that moved with her as she walked. No veil, just her hair loose around her shoulders, a single white wildflower tucked behind her ear. She didn't walk down an aisle. She just stepped out onto the porch, paused for a second to take it all in. The trees, the faces of the people who loved them, the man waiting for her, and then walked straight to him. There were no tears, not yet. Just two people looking at each other like they were seeing something brand new, even though they'd known each other for years. The officiant, a retired teacher who'd mentored them both early in their careers, stood between them, her voice warm and steady as she began to speak. She didn't recite old vows from a book. Instead, she talked about partnership, about showing up even on hard days, about choosing each other again and again, not just once. When it came time for their promises, they spoke simply. "I promise to listen," he said, "even when I think I already know what you're going to say." She smiled and said, "I promise to give you space when you need it, and hold you close when you don't know you do." They didn't say forever in a dramatic way. They just said, "I'm here. I'll keep being here." And then, just like that, they were married. A cheer went up, quiet, respectful, full of love, and someone popped the cork on a bottle of cider. Hugs were exchanged. Photos were taken. Just a few on someone's phone, no professional photographer, no staged poses. And laughter filled the air like music. The nieces ran up to them, holding out slightly squashed cupcakes they'd decorated themselves with too much frosting. "For the bride and groom," they announced proudly. Everyone clinked plastic cups, toasting to love, to quiet joy, to a life built on kindness. After about an hour, the guests began to leave. There were long drives ahead for most of them, and they knew the newlyweds wanted their first evening alone. One by one, they hugged the couple tightly, whispering good wishes, some with tears in their eyes. "Take care of each other," one aunt said, squeezing their hands. "You already do," the bride replied softly. By late afternoon, the last car had disappeared down the winding road, its taillights fading into the distance. Silence settled back over the ridge, deeper now, more intimate. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across the porch. Inside the cabin, the newlyweds stood in the kitchen making tea. They moved around each other easily, like they'd been doing this for decades. Him filling the kettle, her setting out mugs. Both of them stealing glances and smiling like they couldn't believe this was real. They carried their mugs outside and sat on the porch swing, shoulders touching, watching the sky turn from gold to rose to deep violet. No words were needed. They just sat there, breathing the same air, feeling the cool wood beneath them, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. For the first time all day, there was no schedule, no expectations, no one else to think about. Just them. Later, as the temperature dropped, they went back inside. The cabin was cozy. Stone fireplace, worn rugs, shelves filled with old paperbacks and mismatched mugs. They lit a few candles, then decided to start a fire in the wood stove in the main room. It was an old cast-iron model, the kind that radiated heat slowly and evenly. They'd used it the last time they stayed here, and it had worked perfectly. They stacked dry logs inside, crumpled some newspaper, and lit it with a match. The flames caught quickly, crackling cheerfully. They didn't notice anything wrong. The stove looked fine. The room felt warm and safe. They curled up together on the sofa, sharing a blanket, talking in low voices about nothing important. What they'd cook tomorrow, whether they should adopt a dog, how funny it was that Uncle Lou had worn socks with sandals to the wedding. They laughed. They kissed. They felt for the first time in their lives completely at home, not just in a place, but in a person. Outside, the stars came out, bright and countless. Inside, the fire burned, and the newlyweds held each other, unaware that time was slipping away faster than either of them could imagine. They had no idea that this moment, this perfect, ordinary, beautiful moment, was already becoming a memory. All they knew was that they were together, and that was enough. And in that quiet cabin, high in the mountains, with the world asleep around them, they were happy. Truly, deeply happy. Not because everything was perfect, but because they had found someone who made the imperfect feel like enough. They had spent years building a love that didn't need applause, and now finally, they had a lifetime to live it. What they didn't know, what no one could have known, was that the very thing meant to keep them warm would soon take everything away. But for now, in those last precious minutes, there was only peace, only love, only the soft sound of two hearts beating side by side. believing they had all the time in the world. The fire in the wood stove popped softly, sending a tiny shower of orange sparks swirling inside the iron belly of the stove. It was a comforting sound, the kind that makes you feel safe, like the world outside doesn't matter as long as you're warm and dry inside. The newlyweds sat close on the old corduroy sofa, wrapped in a thick wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Their mugs of hot cocoa sat on the low wooden table in front of them, steam curling lazily into the air. Neither of them felt like talking much. After a day full of words, vows, laughter, well wishes, they were happy just to be quiet together, listening to the crackle of the fire and the occasional sigh of wind through the pines outside. The cabin had that special kind of stillness that only exists in remote places, far from highways and streetlights. No distant hum of traffic, no neighbor's TV leaking through thin walls, just the mountain breathing around them. They'd chosen this spot not just for its beauty, but for this exact feeling, like they were the only two people left in the world, and that was perfectly okay. He reached for her hand under the blanket, lacing his fingers through hers. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes half closed, smiling without opening her mouth. They'd been planning this night for months, not the grand gestures, but the small ones. The first meal as husband and wife. They'd brought dried pasta and a jar of sauce, planning to cook it tomorrow. The first time falling asleep in the same bed with new rings on their fingers. The first morning waking up already married. But tonight, right now, was theirs alone. No plans, no expectations, just the two of them in a warm room full of love and tired happiness. Outside, the temperature had dropped sharply after sunset. Frost would likely glaze the grass by morning. Inside, the stove worked hard to push back the cold. They'd added another log about 20 minutes earlier, watching as the flames licked hungrily at the dry wood. It felt good to be warm. They'd both grown up in places where winters were long and biting, and there was something deeply satisfying about tending a real fire. Something their city apartment with its humming radiator could never give them. What they didn't know, what no one could see, was that something was wrong with the stove. Not obviously wrong. No strange smells, no smoke billowing into the room. But high up in the chimney, hidden behind layers of brick and soot, a bird's nest built the previous spring had partially collapsed over the summer. It wasn't a full blockage, just enough to restrict the flow of exhaust gases, and the stove, old and well used, wasn't venting properly. Instead of the fumes rising cleanly up and out into the night sky, some of them were being pushed back down, seeping silently into the cabin through tiny gaps around the stovepipe. Carbon monoxide, the invisible, odorless gas, began to mix with the air they were breathing. It didn't announce itself. It didn't sting their eyes or make them cough. It just slipped in, molecule by molecule, undetectable, patient, deadly. At first, the effects were so subtle they didn't register as anything unusual. She yawned, stretching her legs out under the blanket. "I guess all that standing around today really wore me out," she said with a soft laugh. He nodded, rubbing his temple with his free hand. "Yeah, I feel kind of heavy," he admitted, "like my head's full of cotton." They both chalked it up to exhaustion. It had been an emotional day after all. Joy can be just as tiring as grief. She shifted on the couch, trying to get comfortable, but a dull headache started pressing behind her eyes. She closed them for a moment, thinking maybe she just needed to rest. He noticed her wince. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Just a little headache," she murmured. "Probably from smiling too much today." He chuckled, but then winced himself. "Mine too," he said. "Weird, huh?" Neither of them thought to open a window. Why would they? It was freezing outside, and the room felt perfectly fine, warm, cozy, safe. They didn't know that fresh air was the one thing that could have saved them. They didn't know that the very thing giving them comfort was slowly stealing the oxygen from their blood. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin in red blood cells more tightly than oxygen does. When you breathe it in, it replaces the oxygen your body needs to function. Your brain, your heart, your muscles, they all start to starve even though you're still breathing. And because it's odorless and colorless, your body doesn't trigger alarm bells like it would with smoke or fumes. You just feel off, tired, confused, like you've come down with a sudden flu. She tried to sit up straighter, but a wave of nausea rolled through her. She put a hand to her stomach. "I think I ate too many of those cupcakes," she said, forcing a light tone. He nodded slowly, but his movements were becoming sluggish. "Yeah, maybe," he said, his words slightly slurred, though neither of them noticed. He reached for his mug, but his fingers fumbled and it tipped over, spilling cold cocoa onto the rug. "Sorry," he mumbled, making no move to clean it up. Normally he'd have jumped up with a towel, but now, even that small effort felt impossible. She wanted to help him, but her limbs felt like they were filled with sand. She tried to speak, to ask if he was feeling strange too, but the words got tangled in her throat. Her vision blurred at the edges like someone had smeared Vaseline on her glasses. The firelight, once warm and golden, now seemed too bright, too harsh. She blinked slowly, her eyelids heavy. He turned his head toward her, his expression soft but distant, like he was looking at her through water. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick. She tried to smile, to say something back, but all she managed was a faint nod. Her breathing was shallow now, each inhale a little weaker than the last. She didn't feel scared, just deeply, overwhelmingly tired. Like she could sleep for 1,000 years. Outside, an owl called again, its haunting cry echoing through the valley. Inside, the fire burned on, unaware of the tragedy unfolding in its warmth. The carbon monoxide levels in the room continued to rise, creeping higher with every passing minute. The stove, meant to protect them from the cold, had become a silent trap. They didn't panic. There was no gasping for air, no dramatic collapse, just a slow, quiet fading, like a candle burning down to its last drop of wax. Their hands, still loosely clasped under the blanket, grew colder. Their breathing slowed, then became irregular. Their eyes stayed open but unseeing, fixed on some middle distance where the world had already gone soft and gray. It's hard to imagine how something so ordinary, a cozy fire on a cold night, could turn so deadly. But that's the cruel trick of carbon monoxide. It doesn't roar. It doesn't warn. It just waits, patient and invisible, until it's too late. If there had been a detector on the wall, a small, inexpensive device no bigger than a smoke alarm, it would have beeped loudly, insistently, giving them time to throw open the door, to stumble outside into the clean mountain air. But there wasn't. The cabin had never been required to have one. The rental listing mentioned rustic charm and authentic mountain experience, but said nothing about safety checks or working ventilation. And the couple, trusting the place they'd stayed in before, never thought to ask. They'd been so careful in other ways. They'd packed extra blankets, checked the weather forecast, brought a first aid kit just in case. But they hadn't known to check for something they couldn't see or smell. How could they? Now, as the minutes ticked by, the gas filled their lungs, their blood, their brains. The love that had filled the room just an hour ago was still there, but the people who carried it were slipping away, unaware, unafraid, held gently by the very warmth that was killing them. He murmured something. Maybe her name. Maybe "I love you," but the words dissolved before they reached her. She tried to squeeze his hand one last time, but her fingers wouldn't obey. Her head lolled slightly against the back of the couch, her breathing so faint now it was almost gone. The fire crackled, cheerful and oblivious. Shadows danced on the walls. The candles on the shelf flickered, then went out one by one as the wax ran low. The cabin, once full of joy and promise, grew quiet in a different way, not peaceful but empty, hollow, and still. No one knew. No one was coming. The nearest neighbor was miles away. Their friends were already home, unpacking wedding gifts, smiling at photos on their phones, unaware that the couple they'd toasted just hours ago were now beyond help. Time didn't stop. The clock on the wall ticked steadily forward. The moon rose higher in the sky. The wind picked up, rattling the old window panes. But inside, everything had slowed to a stop. Two hearts that had just promised to beat together for a lifetime were winding down, not with a bang, but with a whisper. It wasn't supposed to end like this, not after everything they'd built. Not after the years of quiet devotion, the shared dreams, the small daily acts of kindness that made up their love. They'd planned to grow old together, to argue over thermostat settings, to adopt that dog, to visit national parks, to sit on a porch someday just like this one, holding hands as their hair turned gray. But life doesn't always follow the script. Sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the greatest dangers, and sometimes the thing that feels safest is the very thing that takes you away. As the night deepened, the fire finally burned down to embers. The room grew colder, but neither of them felt it. They were gone, not in pain, not in fear, but in the gentle arms of a love that had lasted, in the end, only 30 minutes beyond their vows. And the mountains stood watch, silent and ancient, holding the cabin and its quiet tragedy in their vast, unblinking gaze. The fire had settled into a bed of glowing embers, casting faint pulsing light across the walls of the cabin. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a slow breath, and somewhere far off, a creek murmured over smooth stones. Inside, the room was still, too still. No laughter, no whispered jokes, no rustle of blankets being adjusted. Just the quiet hum of a space holding its breath. They were both slumped on the sofa now, not in the way people do when they're napping, but in that unnatural stillness that comes when the body has stopped listening to the mind. Her head rested against the arm of the couch, turned slightly toward him. His hand still lay near hers, fingers almost touching, as if in sleep they'd reached for each other one last time without knowing it. Their chests rose and fell so shallowly that a passing observer might have thought they were already gone, but not quite. Not yet. Carbon monoxide doesn't kill quickly like fire or a fall. It's patient. It works like a thief in the night, stealing oxygen from the blood, molecule by molecule, until the brain can no longer send signals to keep the heart beating. And because it's invisible and odorless, the victims rarely understand what's happening. There's no choking, no gasping, just a growing fog, a deepening fatigue, a sense that something is wrong, but you can't quite place it. By the time the body realizes it's in danger, it's often too late to act. He had tried just minutes before. A flicker of awareness had cut through the haze, enough for him to lift his head to look at her with sudden concern. "Hey," he'd said, his voice thick like he was speaking through water. "You okay?" She'd tried to answer, but her tongue felt heavy, her thoughts tangled. She'd nodded weakly, or maybe she just let her eyes close. He'd reached for her hand, but his arm dropped back to his side before he could grasp it. Then the fog rolled back in, thicker this time, and he sank deeper into the cushions, his eyelids fluttering once before staying shut. She'd felt it too, that strange disconnect between wanting to move and being unable to. Her mind screamed at her legs to stand, to open the door, to get air, but her body wouldn't obey. It was like trying to run in a dream where your feet won't lift off the ground. She remembered thinking, oddly calm, "This isn't right." But the thought floated away before she could act on it, carried off by the same invisible current that was slowing her heartbeat. Neither of them panicked. That's one of the cruelest parts. If they'd been choking or bleeding, they might have fought harder. But this felt like sleep. And after such a long, joyful day, sleep seemed like a gift. So they let go, gently, peacefully, unaware that they were letting go of everything. The cabin, once filled with warmth and promise, now held only silence. The candles had burned out. The embers in the stove dimmed further, their red glow fading to gray ash. The cold from outside began to seep back in through the walls, but neither of them shivered. Their bodies no longer registered temperature. Their systems were shutting down one by one like lights going out in an empty house. Time passed. 10 minutes. 20. The moon climbed higher, casting silver light through the window. A raccoon rustled in the brush near the porch, sniffing the air, then moved on. Inside, nothing stirred. It's hard to imagine how two people so full of life, so recently laughing, holding hands, planning tomorrow's breakfast, could be so still. But that's how it happens. Not with drama, not with warning, but with a quiet finality that leaves the world unchanged while everything inside it collapses. If someone had walked in right then, they might have thought the couple had simply fallen asleep together after a long day. That's what makes carbon monoxide so dangerous. It mimics rest. And in a place like this, so far from help, that mimicry becomes a death sentence. No phone rang. No alarm sounded. The cabin had no carbon monoxide detector, just like thousands of vacation rentals across the country. The owners had never installed one. Inspectors had never required it. And the couple, trusting the space they'd stayed in before, never thought to ask. They'd checked for clean sheets, working plumbing, a stocked kitchen, but not for invisible gas. How could they? It wasn't something you could see or smell. It wasn't on any checklist, and so the gas had done its work unnoticed. By the 25th minute after their last words to each other, their breathing had become so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Their skin had taken on a strange pale pink tint, a telltale sign of carbon monoxide poisoning, caused by the gas binding to blood and changing its color. But in the dim light of the dying fire, it looked like nothing more than the flush of warmth from the stove. At the 28th minute, her breathing stopped. Just like that. No gasp, no struggle. Her chest simply didn't rise again. A few seconds later, his followed. Their hearts beat a few more times on their own, stubbornly clinging to rhythm but without oxygen. Even the strongest muscle fails. And then stillness, complete and final. The clock on the wall ticked past the 30th minute. 30 minutes after they'd whispered "I love you" for the first time as husband and wife, they were gone. Not in a car crash, not from illness, not from violence, but from something as ordinary as a wood stove on a cold night. Something that millions of people use safely every day. But this time, a small flaw, a blocked flue, an old vent, a missing safety device turned comfort into catastrophe. The tragedy wasn't loud. It didn't shake the mountains or wake the neighbors. It happened in silence and shadow, in the space between one breath and the next. And for hours no one knew. The world kept turning. Stars wheeled across the sky. An owl hunted in the valley below. Somewhere a dog barked. Life went on, unaware that 2 lives had just ended in the most preventable way imaginable. Back in the city, their friends were posting wedding photos online. Smiling faces, flower crowns, the wooden arch draped in ivy. Comments poured in, "So beautiful," wishing you a lifetime of happiness. No one knew those wishes would never come true. No one could see the cabin dark and quiet, holding its secret in the folds of the night. Even the stove seemed innocent. It stood there, cold now, just a piece of old iron in the corner. It hadn't meant to harm. It was just doing what it was built to do: burn wood, give heat. But without proper ventilation, even the most well-intentioned things can become dangerous. This is the part that haunts people later, the if-onlys. If only there'd been a detector. If only they'd cracked a window. If only someone had checked the chimney before the season began. If only the rental listing had included a safety checklist. If only they'd known. But they didn't. And that's the heartbreak of it. They weren't careless. They weren't reckless. They were just 2 ordinary people who trusted that the world would keep them safe in their moment of joy. And for 30 minutes it did. Then without warning, it didn't. Now as the night deepened, the cabin held only their absence. The blanket they'd shared lay draped over the sofa, one corner slipping to the floor. Their mugs sat where they'd left them, his tipped over, hers still half full. A single wildflower, the one she'd worn behind her ear, had fallen onto the rug, its petals beginning to curl at the edges. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter on the east window. Inside, nothing moved. No chest rose. No hand twitched. No voice whispered in the dark. They had dreamed of so much. Of lazy Sundays with coffee and newspapers. Of adopting a scrappy rescue dog and naming it after a constellation. Of traveling to places they'd only seen in books. Of growing old together, wrinkled and gray, still holding hands in parking lots. Of building a life not defined by grand gestures but by daily kindness. Making tea when the other was tired. Remembering how they took their coffee. Listening even when they were tired. All of it. Gone. Not because they didn't deserve it. Not because they did anything wrong. But because of a silent, invisible threat that hides in the most ordinary places. And the worst part? It could happen to anyone. That's what makes this story so chilling. It's not about bad luck or fate. It's about something that's preventable, something that happens more often than people realize. Every year, dozens of families, couples, even solo travelers die from carbon monoxide poisoning in cabins, hotels, RVs, and homes, places they believed were safe. This couple didn't know. And because they didn't know, they didn't take the simple steps that could have saved them. A $20 detector, a quick check of the flue, a cracked window. Any one of those things might have made the difference between a lifetime together and a memory cut short. Now, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, painting the clouds in soft pinks and golds, the cabin remained still. The mountains watched, ancient and unmoved. The trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, and inside, 2 people who had just begun their forever lay side by side. Their story ended not with a bang, but with the quiet sigh of a fire going out. No one was coming yet. No siren wailed in the distance. The world hadn't caught up to what had happened here. For now, the truth stayed hidden in the quiet cabin, wrapped in blankets and silence waiting to be discovered. And when it was, it would shock everyone who heard it, Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so ordinary. Because it could have been anyone. Because it could still be someone else tomorrow if we don't learn from it. But for now, in these last hours before the sun fully rose, there was only peace. A terrible, heartbreaking peace, and the echo of two voices whispering, "I do," fading into the mountain air like mist at dawn. The morning sun rose slow and golden over the ridge, spilling light through the tall pines and painting the cabin in soft amber. Dew clung to the grass and birds began their usual chorus, chirping, calling, flitting between branches like nothing in the world was wrong. Nature didn't know. It never does. It just keeps turning, sunrise after sunrise, no matter what happens in the quiet corners of human life. Inside the cabin, everything was exactly as it had been hours before. The blanket still draped over the sofa, the overturned mug on the rug, the wildflower now dry and brittle lying near the hearth, and the two figures on the couch, still silent, peaceful in a way that would soon break hearts. It was supposed to be their first full day as a married couple. They'd talked about it the night before, making pancakes, hiking down to the creek, maybe reading aloud from one of the old paperbacks on the shelf. But the day arrived without them. Around 9 o'clock, a car bumped slowly up the gravel road, tires crunching over loose stones. A friend, the one who'd played guitar at the wedding, had promised to drop off a small gift she'd forgotten. A hand-stitched quilt made by her grandmother, meant to be their first shared blanket in their new life together. She'd stayed up late finishing the last few stitches, smiling as she imagined them wrapped in it on cold nights. She parked near the porch and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. She called out cheerfully, "Hey! Good morning, lovebirds," but got no answer. She figured they were still asleep, understandable after such an emotional day. Still, she walked up the steps and knocked lightly on the door. "It's me. Just dropping off that quilt." Silence. She waited a moment, then tried the knob. It turned easily. The door wasn't locked. "Hello?" she called again, stepping inside. "Hope I'm not interrupting your lazy morning." The room was dim, curtains still drawn. She could see the sofa, the fire pit cold, the mugs on the table, and then she saw them. At first, she thought they were sleeping. They looked so calm, so close, but something felt off. Too still. No rise and fall of breath. No little shifts people make even in deep sleep. Her stomach dropped. She took a step forward, then another, her voice trembling. "Hey, wake up." No response. She rushed to the sofa, dropping to her knees. She touched his shoulder. Cold. She turned to her, gently shook her arm. Please wake up." Nothing. Panic surged through her like ice water. She fumbled for her phone, hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She dialed 911, her voice cracking as she gave their location, her words tumbling out in a rush. "They're not moving. They won't wake up. I think something's really wrong. Please hurry." Then she just sat back on her heels, tears streaming down her face, staring at the two people who had been laughing and holding hands less than 12 hours ago. She couldn't understand. They'd been so happy, so full of life. How could this be happening? Within 20 minutes, red and blue lights flashed through the trees. 2 paramedics and a sheriff's deputy arrived, boots crunching on the gravel as they hurried inside with medical kits and oxygen tanks. The friend stood aside, arms wrapped around herself, shaking. One paramedic checked for pulses, then pupils. The other placed a hand on each of their necks, feeling for carotid arteries. After a few seconds, they exchanged a look, quiet, grim. "I'm so sorry," the lead paramedic said gently to the friend. "They're gone." She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. "But they were fine. Last night they were fine. We just left them here, happy, warm, safe." The deputy stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We'll need to figure out what happened. Did you notice anything unusual? Smell gas? See smoke?" She shook her head, wiping her eyes. "No, nothing. The fire was out. The place smelled like wood smoke, that's all. They must have just fallen asleep." But the paramedics knew better. The pinkish tint to their skin, the lack of trauma, the fact that both went at the same time. It pointed to one thing and one thing only. "We need to test the air," one of them said quietly to his partner. "Carbon monoxide." They pulled out a handheld detector from their kit and turned it on. Within seconds, it beeped sharply, a high-pitched urgent warning. The screen flashed, "Echo levels dangerous." Even hours after the fire had died, Traces of the gas still lingered in the room, trapped by closed windows and poor ventilation. The deputy's expression darkened. He walked over to the wood stove, crouched down and peered up the flue with a flashlight. "There's a blockage," he said. "Looks like a nest or debris. And there's no detector in this place. Not one." The friend stared at him, confusion turning to horror. "You mean they didn't die in their sleep? They were poisoned?" "Looks that way," he said softly, slowly, quietly. "They probably didn't even know." The words hit like a punch. All this time she'd been imagining a peaceful passing, two souls drifting off together in love. But the truth was far more cruel. They hadn't just fallen asleep. They'd been suffocated by something invisible, in the very place they'd chosen for safety and joy. By noon, more officials arrived, state investigators, fire marshals, even a representative from the county health department. The cabin was cordoned off with yellow tape. Cameras clicked. Notes were taken. The stove was carefully dismantled, and sure enough, a crumbled bird's nest, packed with twigs and dried grass, was found lodged deep in the chimney. It had blocked nearly 40% of the exhaust path. Combined with the tightly sealed windows and the age of the stove, it created the perfect trap. Worse still, when the rental records were checked, it turned out the cabin hadn't been inspected for safety compliance in over 3 years, despite local laws requiring annual checks for short-term rentals. Carbon monoxide detectors weren't just recommended. They were mandatory, but none had ever been installed. The owner, an elderly woman who lived in town, arrived in tears, insisting she never knew and always thought the stove was fine. She'd inherited the property from her husband and rented it out to help pay bills, never imagining it could become a death chamber. News spread fast. By evening, local stations were reporting the story. Newlyweds found dead hours after mountain wedding, cause under investigation. Social media lit up with condolences, then questions, then outrage. How could this happen? Why wasn't there a detector? Who was responsible? But for those who knew them, the facts didn't matter as much as the loss. Their families arrived by nightfall. Parents, siblings, cousins, piling out of cars with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. They stood on the porch, unable to go inside, just staring at the cabin like it might give them answers. One mother kept whispering, "They were so careful. They always double-checked everything," as if trying to make sense of a senseless thing. Autopsies were performed the next day. The results were clear. Acute carbon monoxide poisoning. Both had lethal levels of the gas in their blood, enough to cause unconsciousness within minutes and death shortly after. The medical examiner noted they likely lost consciousness before they realized anything was wrong. "It would have been painless," he told the families gently. "They probably just felt tired, and then drifted off." That small comfort that they hadn't suffered was all their loved ones had to hold on to. Funeral plans began almost immediately. Not one service, but 2 families coming together to honor a union that had lasted less than an hour in the eyes of the world, but a lifetime in their hearts. People brought flowers, candles, handwritten letters. Students from their schools made a memory board filled with notes like "You made math fun" and "You always listened when I was sad." Former neighbors shared stories of how they'd shoveled snow for an elderly couple down the street without being asked, or how they'd hosted backyard movie nights for the whole block. Everyone who knew them said the same thing. They were kind. Not in a grand, showy way, but in the quiet, daily choices that build a good life. And that made the loss even harder to bear. It wasn't just 2 people who died. It was a future full of kindness that vanished with them. Back at the cabin, investigators finished their work. The stove was tagged as evidence. The rental license was suspended. The county announced it would be reviewing all short-term rental properties in the area, requiring immediate installation of carbon monoxide detectors and proof of chimney, inspections before any could operate. Again, but none of that brought them back. The friend who'd found them couldn't sleep for days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them on that sofa, so close, so still. She kept replaying the wedding in her head, the way they looked at each other during the vows, the laughter during the toasts, the way they held hands even while eating cake. And then she'd remember the cold skin, the silence, the beeping detector. The contrast was unbearable. She started researching carbon monoxide, how it works, how common it is, how easy it is to prevent. She learned that hundreds of people die from it every year in the US alone, many in vacation homes just like this one. She read stories of families saved by a $25 alarm that went off in the middle of the night, and she realized this didn't have to happen. That realization became a seed. At the memorial service, a simple gathering under the same trees where they'd said "I do," their families stood together and made an announcement. They were starting a campaign. Not for blame, but for change. They wanted every rental cabin, every Airbnb, every hotel room with a gas appliance or fireplace to be required by law to have a working carbon monoxide detector. And they wanted people to know, to really know, that this silent killer is real and it's preventable. "We don't want their story to end in tragedy," one of them said, voice steady despite tears. "We want it to save lives." And as the sun set over the mountains that evening, painting the sky in the same colors as their wedding day, the wind moved through the pines like a sigh. The cabin stood empty now, its door locked, its windows dark. But the lesson it held was just beginning to spread. Because sometimes, the most powerful legacies aren't built in lifetimes, but in the moments after, when love turns grief into action and pain becomes protection for others. And somewhere, in 100 homes across the country, someone would hear this story and go buy a detector. The days after the funeral were quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy kind that settles in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Their families moved through their homes like ghosts, picking up mugs left on counters, folding laundry that would never be worn again, staring at photos that now felt like relics from another life. But grief, as deep as it ran, didn't drown them. Instead, it became something else, a purpose. It started small. One evening, sitting around a kitchen table still cluttered with sympathy cards and half-empty coffee cups, someone said, "We can't just let this be the end." And everyone nodded. Because they knew, really knew, that if the couple had survived that night, they wouldn't have wanted people to just mourn. They would have wanted to fix what went wrong. They would have wanted to protect others. So they began to act. First, they reached out to local lawmakers. Not with anger, but with facts. They brought the autopsy report, the investigators' findings, the rental agreement that listed no safety requirements. They told the story, not as a horror tale, but as a warning wrapped in love. This wasn't bad luck, they said. This was a gap in the system, and gaps like this keep killing people. To their surprise, people listened. A county commissioner, whose own nephew had once been hospitalized from carbon monoxide poisoning during a ski trip, stood up at the UI next council meeting and proposed an emergency ordinance. All short-term rentals in the region must install working carbon monoxide detectors by the end of the month, or face fines and shutdowns. Within weeks, the rule passed unanimously. Inspectors began visiting cabins, campers, and cottages, handing out free detectors to owners who couldn't afford them. But the families knew that laws alone wouldn't be enough. People had to understand, really understand, why this mattered. So they started talking, not in press conferences, but in places where real life happens, PTA meetings, church basements, community centers, even grocery store parking lots. They'd set up a small table with brochures, a working detector they could demonstrate, and a photo of the couple on their wedding day, smiling, alive, full of hope. "We're not here to scare you," they'd say gently. "We're here to say this could have been prevented, and it still can be. For you, for your kids, for your guests." They told the story simply. A cozy fire, a blocked chimney, no alarm, 2 lives gone in 30 minutes. No blame, no drama, just truth. And people responded, not with fear, but with action. Neighbors checked each other's detectors. Landlords installed them without being asked. A local hardware store started offering free installation with every purchase. Even schools began including carbon monoxide safety in their health curriculum. Then came the foundation. They called it the First Breath Foundation, named for the couple's belief that every new beginning deserves a safe start. It wasn't a big organization with fancy offices. It began in a spare bedroom, run by volunteers who'd known them or been touched by their story. Their mission was simple: give away free carbon monoxide detectors to families who couldn't afford them and teach people how to use them. They partnered with fire departments who already did home safety checks but often lacked funding for detectors. Now, when firefighters visited a home for a smoke alarm check, they'd also install a carbon monoxide alarm, courtesy of the foundation. They set up booths at county fairs, handed out detectors at back-to-school nights, even mailed them to rural families who wrote in after hearing the story on the radio. One of the most powerful moments came when a woman called the foundation in tears. She just installed the free detector they'd sent her. 2 nights later, it went off in the middle of the night. She woke her children, got them outside, and called 911. The source? A faulty water heater in her basement. Her family was fine, but she knew without that alarm they might not have been. "You saved us," she told them. "Because of them." That became the foundation's motto. Because of them, others live. Their story also reached beyond their own state. National safety groups picked it up. A major home insurance company featured it in a public service campaign. Love them, protect them, test your detectors. Even vacation rental platforms, updated their safety checklists, now requiring hosts to confirm they have working carbon monoxide alarms before listing a property. But the real change happened in quiet moments, like a father testing his detector every Sunday morning while his kids ate pancakes, or a college student buying a $20 alarm for her first apartment because she remembered a news story from years ago, or a couple on their honeymoon double-checking the cabin's safety features before unpacking their bags. None of these people knew the couple personally, but they carried their legacy in small, life-saving choices. Back home, the families found a strange kind of peace. They still miss them, every day in 1,000 little ways. The smell of pine needles would bring tears. A certain song on the radio would make someone pull over to cry. But they also felt them, in the lives being saved, in the laws being changed, in the quiet hum of detectors beeping during monthly tests across the country. On the 1-year anniversary of the wedding, the foundation held a gathering at the base of the mountain where the cabin stood. They didn't go back to the cabin, it had been permanently closed, but they hiked to a nearby overlook where the view stretched for miles. They released paper lanterns into the twilight, each one carrying a message. We remember, we act, we protect. A local teacher stood up and read a letter the couple had written years ago, never meant to be shared, but found in a journal after their death. It said, "We don't need a big life, just a kind one. If we can make one person feel seen, one day feel lighter, then we've done enough." Now, because of them, thousands felt seen. Thousands had lighter days, because they woke up safe. The foundation kept growing. They started a detector drive every October, what would have been their anniversary month, collecting donations and giving away thousands of alarms. Schools invited them to speak. Firefighters wore first breath patches on their uniforms. Even the cabin's former owner, the elderly woman who'd rented it out, became a volunteer, quietly handing out brochures at the local post office. Her eyes always a little sad, but her hands steady. And the message never changed. It's not about fear. It's about care. Because that's what the couple had always been about, care. Not grand gestures, but the daily choice to look out for someone else, to hold a door, to listen, to make sure the stove was safe before lighting a fire. Now, that same care lived on, not in their voices or their hands, but in the systems they helped build, the habits they inspired, the lives they unknowingly shielded. Years later, a young couple booked a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains for their honeymoon. They arrived with suitcases and excitement, just like the couple before them. But before they even unpacked, they checked the wall near the bedroom door. There it was, a small white device with a green light blinking steadily. They smiled at each other. "Good," one said. "Safe." They never knew whose story made that detector mandatory. They didn't need to. They just lived, laughing, by the fire, walking in the woods, planning their future, because someone else's tragedy became their protection, and somewhere, In the quiet between heartbeats, it felt like love had won after all. Not the kind of love that lasts forever in fairy tales, but the kind that ripples outward, touching strangers, changing laws, saving lives long after the hands that held it are gone. Their marriage lasted 30 minutes in the eyes of time, but in the eyes of those they saved, it lasted a lifetime. And every time a detector beeps, every time a family steps outside into fresh air because of a warning they heeded, every time someone checks a chimney before lighting a fire, that love echoes again. Not in sorrow, but in safety. Not in silence, but in action. Because the greatest tribute to a life cut short isn't just remembering, it's making sure no one else has to suffer the same way. And so, in homes across the country, in cabins tucked in the woods, in apartments